Hello, Oscar and Annabelle, if you're watching this. Hope you are. It's Happy New Year from Grandpa and from Granny and from Moosey. Happy New Year to you all, says Moosey. And I hope you're having a fun day. I love the pictures of you all outside celebrating New Year in the snow with the sparklers. It was great fun. Anyway, and I just hope you're having a great time. So we wish you all the best for a happy and healthy 2023. Can you believe that, Oscar? So how old are you going to be this year? 8? Oh, okay. And Annabelle? 3. That's pretty good. And Daddy? No, better not say that. He was, I think, 39 yesterday, so you'll have to work that out for himself. Anyway, we'll carry on reading some Mr. Men, and the next one is Mr. Nosey. No, it's not very nice, is it, being a nosy sort of person? So, let's see what trouble Mr. Nosey got into. Mr. Nosey liked to know about everything that was going on. He was always poking his nose into other people's business. Mr. Nosey was the sort of a person who, if they came upon a locked door, couldn't resist looking through the keyhole to see why the door had been locked. There is Mr. Nosey looking through the keyhole. Mr. Nosey was the sort of a person who, if he found an unopened letter addressed to somebody else, he would simply have to open it and find out what was inside. Oh no, look, there's an unopened letter, a letter to Mr. Brown at 15 High Street, Tiddletown. And Mr. Nosey's going to look inside. That's very naughty. Mr. Nosey was the sort of a person who, if he was sitting reading his paper on a train, would much rather read the paper of the person sitting next to him. And there's Mr. Nosey sticking his nose across to read the paper of the person next to him in the carriage. Naturally, as you might well imagine, Mr. Nosey was not very popular. People did not like the way in which Mr. Nosey would peek and pry into their affairs. They did not like it at all. But did that stop Mr. Nosey peeking and prying? It did not. And there he is looking out of the window, prying on the people walking by. I don't know. Mr. Nosey lived in a funny, tall, thin house in a place called Tiddletown. The people of Tiddletown decided that Mr. Nosey was becoming much too nosy, and so they held a meeting to discuss what to do about him. So there's Mr. Nosey's house, his tall, thin house, funny little house in Tiddletown. So what do you think they decide? Well, we must find some way of stopping him being so nosy, said old Mr. Chips, the town carpenter. There's old Mr. Chips, the town carpenter. That's right, said Mrs. Washer, who ran the Tiddletown laundry. He needs to be taught a lesson. Whoa. So what's going to happen, do you think? If only we could think of a way to stop him poking his nose into everything, said Mr. Brush, the painter. And then a small smile spread across his face. Listen, he said, now grinning, I have a plan. All his friends gathered round to listen to his plan. And there is Mr. Brush, the painter. The following morning, Mr. Nosey was out walking along Tiddletown High Street when he heard somebody whistling behind one of the closed doors. I wonder what's going on here, Mr. Nosey thought to himself, and tiptoeing up to the door, he quietly opened it and peeped in. So there he is, walking up to the door. My goodness, his nose is big, isn't it? Splash went a very wet paintbrush right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose, covering it with bright red paint. Oh, that's poor Mr. Nosey, with paint all over his nose. That'll teach him a lesson, won't it? Oh dear, I am sorry, said Mr. Brush, who was painting the inside of the door. Poor Mr. Nosey had to go straight home to try and remove the red paint, which was very difficult and rather painful. Mr. Brush chuckled to himself. The plan had begun. Whoa. The following day, Mr. Nosey was walking past the laundry when he heard somebody laughing on the other side of the wall. I wonder what's going on here, he thought to himself, and standing on tiptoe, he looked over the wall. There he is, looking over the wall. Snap went a clothes peg right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose. Look, there's a clothes peg right on the end of his nose. That must have hurt. "Oh dear, I am sorry," said Mrs. Washer, who was hanging up clothes on a washing line on the other side of the wall. Poor Mr. Nosey removed the clothes peg and went off down the street, feeling extremely sorry for himself and for his poor red nose. Mrs. Washer chuckled to herself. The plan was working. Next day, Mr. Nosey was going past a fence when he heard hammering. Bang, 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 bang. There's the fence, look. You can see Mr. Nosey's nose. "I wonder what's going on here," he thought to himself. And creeping very quietly to the end of the fence, excuse me, he peeped round. Bang went a hammer, right on end Mr. Nosey's nose. "Oh dear, I am sorry," said old Mr. Chips, who was nailing up a loose plank in the fence. Look, poor chap had to have a bandage put on the end of his nose. Poor Mr. Nosey had to go home immediately and bandage his poor red sore nose. Mr. Chips grinned a broad grin. The plan was working very well indeed. The following day, Mr. Nosey was walking in the woods when he heard somebody sawing wood. "I wonder what's going on here," he thought to himself, and he crept up behind a tree. There he is, creeping up behind a tree. He was just about to peer out from behind the tree when it suddenly occurred to him that if he did something very nasty might happen to the nose. And so he went on his way without being nosy. And that was pretty clever, wasn't it, Oscar? Behind the tree, with a saw raised in his hand, stood Mr. Herd the farmer. When he saw that Mr. Nosey had gone on his way without being nosy, he laughed and laughed and laughed. And there is Mr. Herd the farmer, laughing and laughing and laughing. That's a big laugh, isn't it? The plan had worked. Mr. Herd hurried into Tiddletown to tell everybody. The plan really had worked, because after that Mr. Nosey stopped being nosy and soon became very good friends with everybody in Tiddletown. And that is the end of the story, except to say that if you are ever tempted to be as nosy as Mr. Nosey used to be, you better expect one thing. What do you think that might be, Oscar? Yes, a sore nose. Goodness knows what would happen. That's a great story. Mr. Nosey, he learnt his lesson, didn't he? Right, so if we've got time, we'll have a little bit of Mr. Uppity. Mr. Uppity, let's learn about Mr. Uppity. What do you think about that last one, Mr. Nosey? Eh, Moosey? Yeah, that was pretty good, pretty good. Right, moving on. Mr. Uppity. This is the story of Mr. Uppity and how Mr. Uppity finishes the story not quite so uppity as at the beginning of the story. You see, Mr. Uppity was one of the rudest people in the world, if not the rudest. He was rude to anybody and everybody. So, of course, in Big Town, which was where he lived, he had no friends at all. Not one. Miserable old Uppity, they used to call him, and he certainly looked it. Wouldn't that be horrible, Oscar? Look at him there. He looks so miserable. Poor Mr. Uppity. Not having any friends. I mean, they're the best thing ever, aren't they, to have good friends? Now, as well as being rude, Mr. Uppity was also rich, very rich. One of the richest people in the world, if not the richest. He had the largest, longest limousine car, that is, in Big Town. He had the largest, longest garden in Big Town. He had, on top of the hill in the middle of Big Town, the most enormous house. The biggest house in Big Town. And there he lived, all alone, miserable old Uppity. Look at his house. That's like a giant castle almost, isn't it? And he lived there all by himself. One day Mr. Uppity was walking in the gardens of his enormous house when suddenly he heard a voice, a little voice. "Hello," said the voice. Mr. Uppity looked, and there, in one of his hundreds of flower beds, was a goblin. Whoa. That reminds me of that walk we did with Daddy. Do you remember, and Annabelle? Oscar? "Aren't you going to say hello to me?" asked the goblin. "Go away," said Mr. Uppity rudely. And there's the goblin. Look. Very happy looking. "Oh, I know who you must be," said the goblin. "You must be Mr Uppity, who's rude to everybody." "Humph," sniffed Mr Uppity rudely. "Well, I know somebody who wants to meet you," said the goblin, and he skipped off the way goblins do. "Come on," he called over his shoulder. Mr Uppity's curiosity got the better of him. He followed. "In there," said the goblin, pointing at a small hole in a tree. "Don't be silly," snorted Mr Uppity. And there's the goblin telling Mr Uppity where to go. And he had to follow him, didn't he? "Oh, I'm not being silly," said the goblin. "Yes, you are," snapped Mr Uppity. "I can't possibly get in there." "Aha," smiled the goblin, and then he said a magic word known only to goblins, which sounded like wobbly gobbly gook. That's a good magic word, isn't it? Wobbly gobbly gook, or something like that. Suddenly Mr Uppity started shrinking. He shrank and he shrank until he was exactly the same size as the goblin. Ha ha! There we are, look. Mr Uppity's now down to the same size as the goblin, so he's really small. "Turn me back to my proper size at once," spluttered Mr Uppity in a rage. "Shan't," grinned the goblin. And so saying, the goblin climbed through the hole into the tree. There he is, climbing through the hole into the tree. Poor Mr Uppity didn't know what to do, so he followed him. Inside the tree there was a staircase going down and down. Oh, that sounds exciting. Do you know where it led to? It led directly to the kingdom of the goblins. Wow, that's a great place. That's where. Whoa, how exciting is that, Oscar? "I demand to be taken immediately to whoever is in charge," said Mr Uppity angrily. "Oh, you shall," grinned the goblin. And he led Mr Uppity through the streets of the kingdom of the goblins until they came to a palace. "Halt, who goes there?" cried the goblin sentry at the gate. "I have brought Mr Uppity," said the goblin. "Oh," said the sentry, and smiled. So there he is going, "Halt, who goes there?" Stopping everybody. But he's happy now he knows it's Mr Uppity. The goblin and Mr Uppity passed through the gates and into a courtyard and through some more gates and along a long corridor and through some large gold doors and into a huge room. There, sitting on a gold throne, was the king of the goblins. Oh yeah, he's got a great crown on, hasn't he? "Your Majesty," announced the goblin, bowing low, "may I present Mr Uppity?" "Ah," said the king, "so you're the fellow who goes about being rude to everybody and doesn't have any friends." "Nonsense," said Mr Uppity rudely. "I can see what I've heard is true," said the king, looking at the indignant Mr Uppity. "You're much too puffed up with your own importance. Therefore," he continued, "I am going to allow you to be turned back to your proper size, but when you get back to Big Town, if you're rude to anybody at all, you will immediately shrink to the size you are now. Do you understand?" The goblin then took Mr Uppity back through the kingdom of the goblins and up the staircase and out of the tree at the bottom of Mr Uppity's gardens. And there he is, coming out of the tree. The goblin looked at Mr Uppity and said something which sounded like "koogly boggly blah 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 blah." Oh, that's a good one. Or something which is probably wobbly gobbly gook, said backwards. And Mr Uppity grew and grew back to his original size. Whoa, that's exciting. "Do you remember what the king said?" warned the goblin. "Don't be so uppity in future." Mr Uppity marched off furiously to going back to his enormous house, and there he is marching off back at his normal size, and there's the little worm saying "Hi" to Mr Uppity. The following day Mr Uppity was out walking through the streets of Big Town. Suddenly he came across a little boy playing with a ball. "Get out of my way," snapped Mr Uppity rudely, but as soon as he said it, you know what happened, don't you? There's the boy playing with the ball. I wonder if we know what happened. Yes, Mr Uppity shrank and shrank until he was no bigger than the ball the boy was playing with. "Oh dear," he gasped, and then he thought, "I'm sorry," he said to the boy. "What I meant to say was, please could I get past?" Immediately Mr Uppity grew to his original size, and the boy moved, and Mr Uppity went on his way. There he is saying, "Sorry, look, he's so tiny. He's no bigger than the boy." Okay, Oscar, I'm going to have to stop there. I'm going to run out of time. Anyway, have a lovely time, and lots of love from me and Granny, and we'll catch up soon. Bye.